My wife came home late last night, but whatever that thing was on my security camera, it sure wasn't her. I waited for a long moment, unsure how to proceed. The longer I watched her, the more I realized just how strange she looked. I didn't notice at first, being half asleep. But now that I was wide awake, it was so obvious that I wondered how I could have not noticed immediately. For starters, she seemed much taller. The top of her head came to just over the little rod we used to hang our different holiday flags. The one I have to stand on my tiptoes to be able to reach. That wasn't the only odd thing about her. Her arms were much too long, hanging down past her knees. Even her face was different. It resembled her, enough that it wasn't instantly noticeable, but when I really looked I could see that her face seemed more narrow, as if it had been stretched from the top of her head to her jaw. And the skin looked too tight, as if it were two sizes too small, the bones underneath pushing hard against the flesh. I was beginning to panic at that point. I didn't know if she'd been in some horrible accident or what, but I knew something was very wrong with her. "Honey, are you hurt?" I asked, my voice shaking. In response to my question, Michelle stamped her foot down on the porch, hard, shaking her head. Before I could say anything else, she reached out and took hold of the doorknob and jiggled it fiercely. I was instantly filled with dread at the mere thought of her getting in. "I'm not letting you inside," I said quickly. I could hear her jiggling the knob frantically, her face still staring up at the camera. She finally let go after a few minutes, and made a sound almost like laughing. The sound of it made my skin crawl. "I'm home," she said. Her voice, like her face, was similar, but not a complete match. It went from nasally, to almost baby-like. "I'm home. Open the door?" I almost closed the app and called 911 right then and there, but I'll admit, I was afraid my wife was having some sort of medical emergency. "Maybe I should call for help," I said. She shook her head again, her long hair whipping from side to side. Then something happened, and that image will stick with me for the rest of my life. Michelle, or the thing that was desperately trying to be her, seemed to stretch right in front of my eyes. Her torso thinned out and grew so that her head slid against the ceiling. Its skin looked so tight that I could actually hear it pulling, wobbling and rubber-like. It had obvious trouble staying on 2 feet, but it managed. It tried to close its mouth, but it couldn't do it completely, and its jaw just sort of hung there against its chest. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, fear overwhelming me. The moment the words left my mouth, her face twisted in a look of pure hatred. It was like I could feel it radiating through the screen. I'd never seen such hate and rage in my life, certainly not on my wife's face. "My wife came home late last night, but whatever that thing was on my security camera, it sure wasn't her." Quick as a flash, she dropped down onto the porch and crawled down the steps and onto the lawn. I watched in horror as she crawled towards the field, her long arms bent at sickening angles. She reached the edge of the field, and disappeared in the tall grass. I sat watching the screen, my heart racing. I was too afraid to look away even for a moment. After an hour without seeing her again, I finally felt safe enough to set the phone down and try to sleep. I thought about calling my wife, but part of me was too scared I'd hear that poor imitation on the other end. I fell into a restless sleep sometime later. I didn't sleep long before my phone woke me again. Another notification. I pulled up the app and held my breath, terrified at what I'd see. When the feed came up, I knew right away that I was looking at my wife. Relief flooded my body. She was standing on the porch, her suitcase at her feet, as she rummaged through her purse. Probably searching for her keys. "Lost your keys again?" I said, pressing the intercom. She jumped at the sound of my voice, almost dropping her purse. "You're up," she said, smiling. "Looks like I have lost my keys. Mind letting me in?" she said, batting her eyes up at the camera. I couldn't help but smile. She always had a way of making me feel completely at ease, even after witnessing a nightmare just hours prior. "I suppose I wouldn't be a very good husband if I let you sleep on the porch all night," I teased. She grinned up at me, and I told her to hang on. I sat up and slipped on my slippers, and got to my feet. That's when I caught some movement on the screen. Far off in the field, a head rose up from the grass, standing tall on a neck much too long to come from anything human. A whimper escaped my lips, and I nearly dropped my phone. I was glued to the floor, unable to look away from that thing watching my house. The head bobbed slightly, then the body rose upwards to meet the head, like a slinky sliding back in position. It stood in the field watching, then to my terror, it began shuffling quickly towards the house on jerky legs. I couldn't help but scream. It was coming for my wife, and it was coming fast, even with its unstable gait. I ran down the hall, dropping my phone in the process, skipping steps as I raced down them. I lost my footing when I hit the bottom, and skidded across the front hall, colliding into the front door. I was screaming incoherently, fumbling with the locks. I could hear my wife's concerned voice, asking me what was wrong. Then, just as I was working to flip the deadbolt, I heard her scream, this time in pure fear. I finally managed to flip the deadbolt and rip the door open, taking a handful of her jacket and yanking her inside, locking the door behind her. I leaned against the door, panting hard. I heard a muffled thump on the porch, but then it was quiet.